What's going on, guys? It's Troydan here, and today we're watching what really happened to Kobe Bryant's helicopter. This was sent in yesterday. It only came out a couple days ago, and oh man, I remember this day. It was a crazy time. I went to Hawaii on a rare vacation, and I didn't even bring a camera. I wasn't gonna vlog or anything. And the next day after just getting in, like the news came. It was absolutely insane. I remember watching it with like barely any internet. I was on a live stream on my cell phone. It was insane. It was an insane day. But I have not seen this. We're gonna watch it. Let's go.
Headline that shocked America and the world. One of the biggest basketball stars of his day, Kobe Bryant of the Los Angeles Lakers, killed in a helicopter crash along with his daughter and 7 others. Millions mourned the loss of the superstar just 4 years into his retirement. But even as the tributes poured in from around the world, down at the Southern California hillside where the accident had happened, investigators were working hard piecing together all of the clues of how this had been possible. And the story that they uncovered was much bigger than Kobe himself. In fact, it's critical for anyone who flies small planes and helicopters, no matter who or where you are.
Okay.
The story began at John Wayne Orange County Airport, or SNA, in Santa Ana, California, on the morning of the 26th of January 2020. On the helipad, a 29-year-old Sikorsky...
Dude, just seeing that day, man. Just seeing that day. It was such a sad time.
S-76B
so
transport helicopter, operated by Island Express Helicopters, was waiting to pick up a very famous passenger. That morning, Kobe Bryant and his 13-year-old daughter were scheduled to fly with 2 other members of his daughter's basketball team, some parents, and a coach. Their destination was Kobe's own sports academy in the city of Thousand Oaks, where he was scheduled to coach the kids' basketball game later on that day. Now, the helicopter had been chartered because driving from Santa Ana to Thousand Oaks through Los Angeles' infamous traffic would have taken more than 2 hours, while a helicopter ride would last just about 30 minutes or so. And the steep price tag wasn't really a problem for a multimillionaire like Bryant. But Kobe was famously picky about helicopters. He knew that taking regular helicopter flights put him at a higher risk of an accident than most people, and he therefore had very strict criteria for any company or pilot whom he allowed to fly him, and especially his children. He had originally approached an air charter company whose work ethic he liked, but they didn't have a helicopter big enough, so they instead offered to act as a broker for him to find one. They eventually only found one helicopter company that met Kobe's strict criteria in terms of helicopter type, safety reputation, and company culture. And that company was Island Express Helicopters. So from that day, Kobe never flew with anyone else. Now, Island Express's main business was conducting charter flights between Los Angeles area airports and the Channel Islands off the coast, hence the name. But they also offered on-demand charters anywhere in the greater LA area, using helicopters of various sizes. The largest type in their fleet was the Sikorsky S-76, a tried and true workhorse commonly used for VIP transport and supporting offshore oil platforms. The specific helicopter used by Kobe Bryant was manufactured in 1991 and had then been acquired by Island Express in 2015, after which they had totally renovated it in order to make it suitable for commercial passenger transport and VIPs.
Damn, it looks
nice. Now,
nice.
The S-76 has a generally good safety record, and this particular helicopter was well maintained and also in a great mechanical shape. In command of the helicopter on this day was a 50-year-old veteran pilot with a very respectable total experience of 8,577 hours, including 1,250 on the S-76, and he was also the chief pilot for Island Express. He was the only pilot trusted by Kobe to fly his kids unaccompanied, and he flew the family quite regularly. In fact, they knew each other so well that they had reportedly become friends. Now, in addition to being the chief pilot, he was also a rated flight and ground instructor, and he held an instrument rating, allowing him to fly in instrument meteorological conditions, or IMC, without visual references to the ground. But Island Express's flight operated under visual flight rules, or VFR, which means that they were required to maintain visual contact with the ground at all times and couldn't legally enter into IMC. Therefore, the pilot had very little actual instrument time, just 75 hours, of which only 7 were in actual IMC. The rest had been simulated by him wearing a hood to block his view out of the windows, and using a hood is a common training technique since it can simulate instrument meteorological conditions even on a sunny day. And that allows instrument training to be done at any time without having to wait for the right type of weather. And also, it allows visual references to be quickly re-established if necessary. But wearing a hood just isn't as effective at really solidifying instrument flying techniques as real experience in IMC for reasons that I'll get to shortly. Anyway, the pilot reported for duty that morning, feeling good after a normal night's rest, and he had started preparing for Kobe's charter flight as soon as he got into the office.
I thought he was going in for a second, bro.
The plan
Sorry.
was to fly from Santa Ana over to Camarillo Airport, which was the closest airport to Kobe's Sports Academy, transiting via low-altitude VFR airspace over Los Angeles, then through the Class C airspace surrounding Burbank and Van Nuys Airport, and then west to Camarillo by following the US Highway 101 over the Santa Monica Mountains. During the previous day, he had flown Kobe to the same destination by heading due west from downtown Los Angeles directly over the mountains to Camarillo, but based on the weather reports from this morning, it was clear that that wouldn't work. So after ferrying the helicopter from Long Beach to Santa Ana, the pilot had spoken to the owner of the broker that I mentioned earlier and had showed him the weather situation on the 4Flight app that he had installed on his cell phone. It was showing blue weather returns near the destination, meaning a cloud ceiling between 1,000 and 3,000 feet above ground level, but there were also red returns over downtown Los Angeles, Burbank and Van Nuys, including ceilings between 500 and 1,000 feet over there, and or visibility of 1 to 3 miles. The pilot stated that he had wanted to go up and around the red area by flying to the Dodgers Stadium east of downtown LA, then around the outside of Burbank and then Van Nuys via State Route 118. And at the time, Burbank was reporting a visibility of 3 miles in haze and clouds at 1,100 feet above ground level, whilst Van Nuys was reporting the same ceiling and 2.5 miles of visibility. The National Weather Service had also issued an AirMet notice warning of instrument flight rules, IFR conditions in the Santa Monica Mountains, with mountain obscuration in clouds and mist. Now, the dominant weather phenomenon here was something called a marine layer. That's basically a widespread, low-topped layer of fog or low clouds that moves onshore from the ocean each morning, something that is very common along the Californian coast. Now, in Los Angeles in January, inland high pressures typically force that marine layer offshore by mid-morning, but on this day it was unusually persistent, creating worse than normal visibility over parts of the pilot's planned route. The information contained in the AirMet and the latest weather observations from the en route airport would have been provided to the pilot during a routine pre-flight weather briefing, something that was required by Island Express. But investigators later couldn't find any record of the pilot actually receiving a briefing on that day.
Oh, okay.
Now, he might have accessed this weather information via 4Flight instead, but we don't really know for sure, since that information wasn't recorded.
Okay.
So in the end, it's not clear if the pilot fully understood the weather conditions he was going into, especially in the mountains, where the terrain elevation along US 101 was very close to the reported cloud ceilings at nearby Burbank and Van Nuys. Penetrating that area would be difficult under the reported conditions, especially if he was to comply with both visual flight rules and the company minimum altitude of 300 feet above the terrain, where 500 or 1,000 feet was actually recommended. Nevertheless, the pilot eventually told the broker that he felt that the flight could be flown as scheduled, and the director of operations at Island Express also independently agreed, which just goes to show that both of those people probably didn't have the complete information about the actual weather up in the mountains. Now, keeping yourself up to date with this kind of information is obviously crucial, especially when flying VFR. But it's not the only place where you have to be careful with information. When my team and I research these type of videos, we sometimes find ourselves in some pretty questionable corners of the internet. You know, places where you might get asked to log in or provide info to get access to certain articles and reports. So making sure that we don't get hacked, phished or scammed when we do this becomes a huge priority. And that's where today's sponsor, NordVPN, comes in. You see, Nord is built with 20 to use anything by trying. Thank you, Nord.
NordVPN.
Thank you, Nord. Now let's get back to the video. Just before time 0900 local, Kobe Bryant and the rest of the passengers arrived at the airport and boarded the helicopter, squeezing themselves onto 2 4-abreast bench seats in the cabin. Up front, the pilot sat in the right seat, which is the captain's seat in most helicopters, while the left pilot seat was
Look
empty.
at all those knobs, bro.
Now, although many operators of the Sikorsky S-76 used 2-pilot crews, it was approved for single-pilot operations, and Island Express usually only provided 1 pilot unless the client specifically asked for 2. So, after completing the pre-flight checks and checking that everyone was strapped in, the engines were started, and the pilot soon raised the collective and took off from the helipad, initially heading northwest across Los Angeles towards the first
I think the helicopter also had like Kobe's logo and everything on it as well. I remember seeing like the pictures of it as like before the incident. And it had like the Mamba, it was all black, I believe. It was a nice looking helicopter.
That first leg was then completed uneventfully, and the pilot had no problems maintaining enough terrain clearance without straying into the cloud layer above. So they were just cruising above the vast LA sprawl at 140 to 150 knots. 13 minutes after takeoff, while in the area of Dodger Stadium, the pilot then called ahead to the tower at Burbank Airport and requested a special VFR clearance through Burbank's airspace. A special VFR clearance grants permission for a VFR flight to enter controlled airspace near an airport under weather conditions that doesn't fully meet the minimums for basic VFR. For that, helicopter operations in the airspace near Burbank would need a visibility of 3 miles or more. But the visibility at Burbank had now dropped down to only 2.5 miles, so the pilot had to request special VFR clearance in order to proceed. Now, this was a pretty routine occurrence in the Los Angeles region, so the request wasn't unusual by itself, but the fact that conditions had worsened at Burbank should maybe have started raising some questions from the pilot about what the weather and visibility would be like along the US 101
Yeah, I think so.
Anyway, the Burbank Tower didn't immediately grant the special VFR clearance due to some conflicting traffic. Instead, they instructed the helicopter to hold over Glendale, just outside Burbank's airspace, to wait for some space to open up. And while the helicopter is sitting in this holding pattern, I want to address a couple of questions that might be starting to bubble up here. The main question being, why the pilot decided to undertake this flight in the first place when he knew that there were low cloud ceilings in the mountains along his flight path. I have already mentioned the incomplete weather information, but that alone just doesn't explain it all. One myth which came out in an attempt to answer this question was that the pilot was pressured to complete the flight either by Island Express, the broker, or by Kobe himself.
That's what I think too.
But the truth is that the National Transportation Safety Board couldn't find any record or indication of outside pressure that could have led the pilot to take this risk. In fact, the evidence points to the contrary. All the other Island Express pilots who were interviewed said that the company was fully behind any decision to delay or cancel a flight due to weather. And the record shows that over the last several years there had been more than 150 weather-related cancellations, one of which even involved Kobe Bryant. Also, the pilots reported that in not a single one of those 150 cases had a client complained or asked them to attempt to do the flight anyway. Remember, Kobe knew that flying on helicopters could be risky, so with his daughter on board, it would have been unthinkable for him to try and overrule a pilot who thought it wouldn't be a good idea to fly. The airline even had regular safety meetings where they encouraged their pilots to stop a flight, land at the nearest airport, and book the passengers a taxi if the weather conditions started getting too sketchy. And nobody who spoke to the NTSB had personally witnessed this particular pilot engaging in any type of risk-taking behavior. So that brings us to the obvious question, why did he do it then? Well, the answer here is likely that just because nothing external was putting pressure on him doesn't mean that the pilot didn't feel pressure to get his passengers to their destination on time.
Yeah.
In fact, self-induced pressure can be just as dangerous as external pressure. We pilots always want to get our passengers to their intended destination because we have all kinds of emotions tangled up in that goal. Things like pride and our own sense of legitimacy can rest on completing that mission, especially in intimate missions like this one. But what I want to really emphasize here is that this type of pressure can happen to anyone. You don't really need to have someone like Kobe Bryant in the back seat in order to feel it. This could still happen if that person is one of your best friends, your mom, or someone you don't even know. And sometimes it can even happen when you're flying without any passengers at all. Now, the way you combat this pressure is by drawing up hard minimums for yourself. You need to tell yourself, if the visibility is worse than X or the cloud ceiling is below Y, well then I just won't go. I'll land the plane or the helicopter and I'll get a taxi. And if you ever think that you're letting someone down, just ask yourself, would your passenger want you to take this risk? Probably not, right?
No, of course not.
Now I also want
Unless
to
they're an
mention
asshole.
that Island Express had actually created a framework that should have helped this pilot resist the pressure and avoid taking this risk. The company required its pilots to fill out a risk analysis form before each flight where they checked boxes for certain risk factors, which corresponded to certain required mitigation actions. In this case, the pilot had checked the box for cloud ceilings below 2,000 feet. But he hadn't checked the boxes for special VFR en route and visibility under 3 miles, even though the reported conditions at Van Nuys did meet the criteria for those boxes. Now, if he had, that form would have told him to draft an alternative plan for the flight in case conditions didn't permit him to follow the intended route, which would have been great because that's what he should have done anyway. This form was just a consistent reminder to do it when the conditions met certain thresholds. But sadly, in this particular event, the pilot never created a plan B, at least none that we are aware of. If he had, then it would likely have been psychologically much easier for him to change plans once he realized that the conditions might be too bad up in the mountains. And it would have also meant that he could have briefed the passengers about that possibility so that it wouldn't come as a surprise or a disappointment. But now, without that plan B, he increased the mental cost of taking a less direct route or landing the helicopter short of the destination, and therefore also increasing the risk of making an ill-advised decision to continue. That's what we in the industry call plan continuation bias, which is the same as get-there-itis that I've mentioned in some of my previous videos. Ultimately though, the NTSB found that the airline still wasn't doing enough to ensure that their pilots filled out their risk management forms correctly and took the recommended actions, which is important because without that follow-up, the forms just become pointless paperwork, which the pilots will skip at will, which is probably what also happened here. But even if you aren't flying for a company that gives you risk analysis forms before each flight, which is pretty unusual for small charters like this, it's still best practice to always have a plan B. That's what we always do in the airlines, and if you're a private pilot out there or you fly for a small company, you should definitely do so as well. In any case, back on board the helicopter, whilst still waiting for clearance to enter Burbank airspace, the pilot asked the controller what the height of the cloud tops were. And he was then quickly informed that the tops were reported at 2,400 feet, which meant that the clouds were only about 1,000 to 1,300 feet thick, typical for a marine layer. The controller also added that the pilot should expect to head north along Interstate 5 before heading west along State Route 118 north of Van Nuys Airport for traffic reasons. And the pilot was fine with that because that was really what he had planned to do anyway. After 11 minutes in the hold at time 09:32, the Burbank controller finally granted the pilot a special VFR clearance along the previously specified route, and he added that the current weather in both Burbank and Van Nuys was still a visibility of 2.5 miles and a cloud ceiling at 1,100 feet. The pilot acknowledged this and then proceeded along Interstate 5 and State Route 118 as cleared before contacting Van Nuys at time 0935 to request another identical special VFR clearance through that tower's airspace. This was also granted, so the pilot now followed SR 118 west past Van Nuys before dropping south towards US 101 for the final push over the mountains. At that point, Vanois handed the helicopter over to the Southern California Tracon facility, which was responsible for the airspace over to the west, and the pilot contacted them at the time 0940. He then told the Tracon controller that he was flying in VFR conditions at 1500 feet at the time, and that he planned to proceed to Camarillo. The Tracon controller responded that he would most likely lose radio and radar contact with the helicopter over the mountains, and that the pilot should reset his transponder code to 1200, which is the code for uncontrolled VFR traffic. Now, the controller then expected that the pilot would contact Camarillo Tower after that, meaning that his facility wouldn't speak to this helicopter again. Shortly after that conversation, at the time 0942, the pilot intercepted US 101 and began to follow it westbound into the hills, with no idea that this was a mistake that would ultimately doom them all. As the helicopter continued westward, witnesses along US 101 now saw it passing overhead, whizzing along just below the indistinct, hazy cloud base.
Really? There were dash cams?
Both the witnesses and some camera footage from the area showed marginal conditions at the time, with a poorly defined ceiling amid loads of haze and mist. From photographs and videos, investigators estimated that the forward visibility was only around 1 to 1.5 miles at this point, and the tops of the surrounding mountains were completely obscured.
Oh my, the conditions
now,
insane.
Just ahead on this route, the helicopter was also facing a local weather phenomenon, known to meteorologists familiar with the area, but possibly not to the pilot.
Oh.
You see, under marine layer conditions like this one, cold air under the layer could become trapped in a low point along US 101, just west of Calabasas. And that could cause much worse local visibility in that area than in the surrounding. Now, the pilot might have had more time to realize that the conditions were deteriorating as he approached this area, if it weren't for the fact that he was still maintaining the standard cruise speed of 140 knots. FAA guidance for helicopter operations in marginal VFR urges pilots to slow down to between 60 and 100 knots when approaching an area of reduced visibility. And that's supposed to be done in order to increase the available time to react if conditions suddenly deteriorate below acceptable levels. So if this pilot would have slowed down and tried to objectively assess what he was getting into, he might now have turned around, but instead, he just continued. The self-induced pressure, the lack of a plan B, and possibly some complacency caused by his familiarity with the route all now drove him and his passengers straight into this trap. But to understand just how deadly these kind of conditions can be and why, I want to talk about something that we in the industry call VFR into IMC. This is an event in which a pilot operating under visual flight rules, that is, flying with respect to visual references outside of the plane,
these simulations are crazy. Is this the Microsoft
suddenly enters into
flight
an
simulator,
area
or
of
is this something
instrument
else?
meteorological conditions. When this happens to a pilot who isn't instrument rated, it's one of the most dangerous situations you can ever encounter, since it comes with extremely high risks of disorientation and physical illusions. You see, without visual references, the human vestibular system can't distinguish between gravity and acceleration, and therefore quickly loses its ability to determine its orientation in space. And if you think that the solution is just as simple as looking at your instruments, it can be, but normally it isn't. When we pilots get our instrument rating, we have to undergo rigorous training, teaching us to ignore vestibular cues and instead focus on maintaining a strict instrument scan that allows us to rebuild our mental picture of how we are oriented. So a pilot without this training who enters IMC will struggle to keep the plane on course and upright, even if they know that they have to trust their instruments. It's just not instinctive at all. Also, the moment that a pilot like that glances away from the attitude indicator for any reason, those powerful vestibular cues will start pushing the brain into making corrective inputs. And before you know it, you're unconsciously steering the plane into a spiral. Actually, it's for this very same reason that it's really hard to walk across a field with your eyes closed.
Why do you gotta show
If
feet?
you ever try it, you'll find that virtually every single time you'll end up walking in circles. In aviation, this effect is so dangerous that VFR into IMC accidents are actually the leading cause of fatalities among private pilots pretty much everywhere in the world. Studies have even shown that in VFR into IMC accidents, the average time between entering IMC and losing control or striking terrain is just 178 seconds, which is truly terrifying. Now, sometimes people's response to these statistics is to say, well, I simply won't fly into IMC. But it's not always that simple. Some VFR into IMC accidents are caused by pilots recklessly flying into obvious IMC, but most actually aren't. Instead, they happen because conditions turned out to be worse than what was forecasted, and you're too slow to recognize that what maybe had been nice VFR conditions a while ago are now turning into IMC all around you. Also, pilots sometimes continue flying into these kind of conditions because they believe that better visibility is just right around the corner, but even if it is, just a couple of minutes in IMC can easily be fatal. But now you might be thinking, didn't the pilot of Kobe's helicopter have an instrument rating? Shouldn't that mean that he was able to fly through IMC if needed? Well, the answer to that is, once again, it's not that simple. In fact, almost a third of VFR into IMC accidents involve a pilot with an instrument rating. And the two things that really allow a pilot to fly safely through IMC are an instrument mindset as well as recent experience. Now, remember how this pilot only had 7 hours in real instrument time?
That's crazy.
And how he almost
7
never
hours.
encountered IMC outside of the training environment,
The
since
visor on.
Island Express only performed VFR flights? Well, because of that, chances are that his instrument flying skills were pretty rusty. And to make matters even worse, there's little chance that he had developed an IFR mindset before this flight. Even experienced IFR pilots can get into trouble in IMC during a VFR flight when they're in the VFR mindset, by which I mean that they're focused on staying clear of clouds and looking outside. And then, as the conditions start deteriorating, this task becomes more and more complex and demanding until suddenly they're in IMC, but their attention is still 100% focused on trying to see their way forward, instead of switching over to their instruments. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that a pilot really has to be mentally prepared for instrument flight in order for it to be successful. Now, in the airline world where I operate, everything we do is IFR. So from the moment we take off until the moment we get the runway in sight before landing, we are just looking at our instruments. So this means that when we fly into IMC or clouds or wherever it might be, we're so ready for that it makes absolutely no difference at all. But the last thing that you want to do is to try and establish yourself on instruments after you've already lost visual references in a VFR flight. Because by that point, you have very limited time before you start to lose your bearings. And with that in mind, let's return to the story. As the pilot now pressed onward through the hills, the terrain beneath him started rising up until the distance between the terrain and the cloud base was very close to the company minimum operating height of 300 feet. Now, the pilot might have hoped that he could still just squeeze through under the cloud base, but that hope was dashed just a few seconds later when he crested the high point and hit that low spot where the cold air had gathered. Remember the one that I mentioned earlier? One witness described seeing the helicopter disappearing into what looked like a wall of clouds,
Jeez.
completely blocking the view to the west. And with the visibility already restricted to just a mile or so and at a forward speed of 140 knots, the pilot wouldn't have had enough time to see it coming until he was suddenly inside of it. Within 2 seconds of the time the witness saw the helicopter disappear, the pilot called the Takeoff controller and told him that he was now in IMC and was planning to climb above the layer. But that wasn't what pilots were trained to do during a VFR into IMC situation. Instead, the pilots had been taught that entering IMC is an emergency that requires them to aviate and navigate before trying to communicate. At Island Express, the specific procedure was to use the attitude indicator to achieve level flight with pitch and roll inputs, set engine thrust to 70 to 75% torque, establish a positive climb at 75 to 80 knots on the current heading, and making only turns if it was critical to avoid known obstacles. Now, once the helicopter was established in this configuration, which should take only a few seconds or so, Well, then the procedure called for engaging the autopilot, allowing it to carry the helicopter out of the area of IMC before the pilot had time to get disoriented. And critically, only after verifying that the autopilot was taking the helicopter to safety should the pilot call air traffic control, declaring an emergency and specifying that they are a VFR flight in IMC. But like I said, that's not what this pilot now did. Instead, he tried to start the climb and report the climb to ATC simultaneously. This turned out to be doubly inappropriate because the Tracon was no longer providing services to him, which he had acknowledged just a couple of minutes earlier. FAA guidance actually warned that in this situation, your first instinct would likely be to call ATC because of the natural desire to seek help in a stressful situation. So the fact that he made this call, despite his training, suggests that he was now under a great deal of stress. To make matters even worse, during the minutes preceding this, a shift change had occurred at the Tracon, so the controller who now heard this call wasn't the same one who he had talked to a minute earlier. This new controller had no idea who he was or where he was located because his helicopter was displayed on the radar as a generic VFR aircraft squawking 1200. In other words, not his responsibility. So in order to provide help to the pilot, he now had to first identify him on radar. And the way controllers do that is to tell the pilot to squawk ident on the transponder. This would require the pilot to press an ident button on the transponder panel, highlighting the aircraft's transponder code on the controller's radar screen. But that would also require the pilot to find that button. So this was exactly what now happened, and at that moment the helicopter was in a climb of 1500 feet per minute, which was a lot faster than the climb rate specified in the VFR into IMC emergency procedure. This again suggested that the pilot was under stress, maybe even panicking slightly now, and definitely not following his training. It is possible that he remembered that the cloud tops were not too far above him, so maybe he thought that if he just climbed quickly enough, he could break through back into visual conditions before he had time to get disoriented. But when the controller now asked him to squawk ident, he had to take his attention away from the attitude indicator in order to find and press that ident button. And in that brief moment of distraction, disorientation took over. Just a couple of seconds later, the helicopter stopped climbing at an altitude of 2,370 feet and then began to descend. Up until that point, the pilot had also been in a left turn that closely followed US 101, suggesting that he still had some sense of his position relative to the now invisible landmarks. But that now changed too. At almost exactly the same time as the helicopter began to descend, the left turn now increased, diverging away from the route of US 101 and entering into a tightening spiral. The controller asked the pilot to state his intentions, and he replied that he was climbing to 4,000 feet. But at that moment, the helicopter was actually descending rapidly, just proving that the pilot was now badly disoriented. Here, he was most likely experiencing two vestibular illusions simultaneously. The first was the somatogravic illusion, which is when the vestibular system interprets forward acceleration as a nose-up pitch, causing the pilot to believe that the plane is climbing when it's actually accelerating downwards. And the second one is known as the leans, which happens when the brain adjusts to a continuous bank and reinterprets that orientation as the new wing's level, causing the pilot to erroneously increase the bank angle more in order to continue the turn. So, afflicted by both of these illusions and unable to reorient himself into an instrument mindset while under extreme stress, the pilot now likely had no idea that he was spiraling downwards directly towards the side of a mountain. Now, in response to the pilot's report that he was climbing to 4,000 feet, the controller asked what he intended to do once he was up at that altitude, but there was no reply back. At almost that exact time, a witness on a bike trail near US 101 saw the helicopter suddenly descend out of the dense clouds at a high rate before it hit the side of a mountain and exploded. The witness immediately called emergency services and then rushed over to the scene in order to search for survivors, but unfortunately, all 9 occupants, including Kobe Bryant and his daughter, had been killed instantly on impact. The National Transportation Safety Board found that the cause of the accident was the pilot's decision to continue flight on the VFR into an area of deteriorating visibility until he lost visual references and became disoriented. They cited planned continuation bias and self-induced pressure to complete the flight among the reasons for the pilot's ill-advised decision. Investigators also found that while Island Express had gone above and beyond regulatory requirements by adapting a safety management system to address safety issues proactively, the system had not been fully implemented. And as a result, it didn't detect that pilots were not making adequate preparations for flights in marginal weather. But this accident illustrates a problem that extends far beyond just this company and pilot. The fact is that this type of accidents happens to private pilots and small charters quite often, claiming many lives over the years, including other celebrities like John F. Kennedy Jr. and Buddy Holly. Now, I chose to highlight Kobe Bryant's crash here on this channel because it's useful as a famous example of the dangers of VFR flight into IMC, even if you have an instrument rating and you're flying an IFR-capable aircraft. So if you are a private pilot out there, or you fly for a company that operates VFR flights, the best way for you to avoid this is to establish clear, quantifiable minimums for yourself in terms of visibility and cloud ceiling. And always, always be prepared to cancel or land immediately if it looked like the conditions might fall below those minimums. Now, this was obviously a slightly different episode than my normal airline-oriented videos. Please let me know what you thought about it, and if you wanted to expand.
This whole channel is great. Most of the stuff, like with the technical side, went way over my head. I can't even pretend to understand. But yeah, man, this was really eye-opening because I never really understood what had happened. And just in my head, I just assumed that I didn't really question what really went down. I know they crashed into a mountain, but I didn't really understand the whole thing behind it. God damn, this was such a terrible time, man, just thinking about this. I remember something too that I kind of forgot, that after Kobe passed away in this helicopter crash, the next day I had to go on a helicopter tour. I remember doing that, and I was like, this is crazy to do, but oh my god, yeah, this wow, it's just insane to go back to this, but really an eye-opener, I guess, for flying with helicopters. It's just sad. It's just a sad thing. Guys, if you got a video you'd like me to watch or react to, post to my Discord. Thank you for watching, and kids, stay out of trouble.